So we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Leyla Arabian. I am your host for today's discussion. I work with the amazing folks here at Semgrep. I am on the sales side of things. So I am not directly involved in software supply chain security like the rest of our panelists are, but I'm super excited to be hosting our conversation. As you all know, we'll be discussing best practices and innovations for securing the software supply chain. This includes supply chain risk management, vendor analysis, dependency management, SBOM, automated vulnerability scanning. We'll see if we get through all of that in our allotted time frame. But again, I'm very, very happy and excited to be here. As I said, it looks like we've got most people here right now. So I'm going to go ahead and let our panelists introduce themselves. Nicole, I will start with you, and then we can go around the virtual room.
All right, I'm Nicole Schwartz. I use she, her pronouns. I am a project manager over at Active State, specializing in supply chain security. Surprise! In my not day job hours, I run the Diana Initiative, B-Sides Edmonton, and Sky Talk. So if anyone was at a Hacker Summer Camp, you probably saw me.
Amazing. Andrew, would you like to go next?
Yep, my name's AJ King. Well, my name's Andrew. Everybody, all my friends call me AJ. My day job is I'm a CISO for Hunter Strategy, which is a managed security services firm on the East Coast. I also am an IANS faculty member with Tanya, and then run a couple of other small businesses as well on the side. So my day job, I would say I talk a lot about third-party vendor risk management and actually working with, I would say, the end users, right, of supply chain security. On a day-to-day basis.
Awesome. Kyle, I'm going to throw it over to you, and then Kayla, you can go ahead and finish off our introductions.
Sure. So my name is Kyle Kelly. I'm a security researcher at Semgrep on the software supply chain product. In addition to that, I have a weekly newsletter called Crime Hacks, where all I do is talk about software supply chain security and open source software security. So I have my weekly newsletter, also blog posts, all just deep interest and obsession about software supply chain. It's a little concerning sometimes, but.
I'm Kayla. I am a lead security technologist at HackerOne. I work in the office of the CTO. One of my main initiatives is working on the Internet Bug Bounty, which is our open source bug bounty program. So we support open source projects, reward valid vulnerabilities discovered in the source code, and we also work with the customers who help support that program. And then beyond that, I've been a security practitioner for many, many years. And so there's a lot of vulnerability management background for me. So more on the vulnerability scanning and life cycle vulnerabilities in a more corporate environment, I would say, for sure, from my past places I've worked at. So yeah, excited to be here today.
Wonderful. Thank you all. So we do have some questions that I'm going to be asking the panelists, but for all the attendees, if you do have a question, if you came prepared, feel free to drop it in the chat. I will go ahead and read it out. And as always, please keep it respectful, kind, and appropriate for our panel here today. So I'd like to start us off with kind of a, hotter topic, maybe a great first question. And I'll pose that to Kyle. Kyle, you can start us off. So what are some of the biggest challenges that we face in securing the software supply chain, and how can we address these challenges?
Yeah, I was really hoping I was not going to be starting this one. I kind of break it up into three kind of different major issues. So we have like the vulnerability disclosure or vulnerability management field, and I'm thinking more like holistically, like the CVE program, for example. We're only just now starting to make strides in understanding how do we properly document and distribute upstream vulnerabilities. So a vulnerability that's affecting maybe like a schema, a protocol, or like a just very commonly used software package. And then we have the next step, which largely impacts the open source security space, in that even if we can find bugs in open source packages, there's still a tremendous amount of work that's needed to do the triaging and then also the fixing. And that's a lot of burden to put on open source maintainers who oftentimes are doing this out of interest, as a hobby, and things of that nature. So yeah, those are kind of like the three, the actual vulnerability management side of things, and disclosure process, and then the triage and the fix. So everything, essentially.
One big dumpster fire.
Great
But it looks
answer.
like
Great
we have
answer.
a guest. Yay!
Yes, we have a
We're back.
guest. We have Allie Diamond joining us. Allie, would you like to introduce yourself and we can resume with the questions?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Sorry, there was an email with there was an issue with the email they registered me with, so I've been like trying to join for like 15 minutes. But okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Allie Diamond. By day, I work as a software engineer at a fintech company of over 5,000 people. And then at night, I work as a content creator and as the host and producer of ThreatWire, which focuses on cybersecurity. So it's a new show that focuses on cybersecurity. So I've always had an interest in cybersecurity and excitement about it. And I really like supply chain because I am your end goal. Like I just think it's such an awesome combination of everything development, but also security at the same time. And also like a touch of social engineering and it's just everything combined. And it just really gets me get excited about it, you know?
Awesome. That's amazing. We were just discussing some of the biggest challenges we face in securing the software supply chain. Allie, Kayla, AJ, Nicole, anything to add to Kyle's answer?
You don't know what you have in a lot of cases, I think. So just knowing, because it's turtles all the way down. If you haven't heard that phrase, it just means that it's kind of recursive. The open source uses open source, which uses open source. So like you were saying earlier, Kyle, there's vulnerabilities that are found somewhere. Where is that in your environment? It doesn't even have to be that you've pulled in a dependency into your code. You could be using it on your container or something else. So sometimes it's just getting your head around, what is my supply chain? What do I actually have? And what do I need to protect? I think is a really big problem.
Yeah, I would agree with you. The moment you said turtles all the way down, it was just I instantly thought of the XKCD, right? Of like that one guy in Nebraska, right? That's holding all of this up, right? And speaking of it from I would say a consumer of that software, right? Perspective, dealing with downstream companies, I would say the vast majority of organizations today can't even handle third-party vendor risk management, right? From just a manpower perspective, much less even start to tackle things around the software supply chain side of things, right? Because, as Ali said, it touches in so many places on so many teams, right? What ends up happening in my experience is that it's very hand-wavy. Hey, we need supply chain security. You look like you can do supply chain security. Here, other duties is assigned, right? So that's what I would say when, rubber meets the road. That's what I see as some of the biggest challenges there.
Yeah, and I think another challenge is that the space that we have, that is technologies being introduced every day, new companies being introduced every day, new needs internally are not only is the idea of software supply chain still this developing practice that's becoming more standardized and scientific along the way, but our vendors and suppliers and the integration points between all of us is growing and expanding at a rate that we don't even have the foundation laid to be able to handle what we have, right? We don't even know what we have today. And then you're adding on this expansive growth on top of it where, everybody needs this new tool in order to do this thing better. So when you're talking with your internal vendor management or third-party risk management teams, they're swamped too. So not only were they probably picked as like, you look like you could do this, it's also like, 50 people all piling on at the same time being like, I need this new tool, I need this thing. And so to be able to like hold the line in this space where the line has yet to really even be built properly, I think that's another huge challenge we're facing.
Yeah, and I just posted a link, Kayla. That's how many vulnerabilities is super important, right? I mean, I think I just looked, this is the National Vulnerability Database, right? And there's 110 new CVEs today, right?
Well,
like how is anyone supposed to keep up with that in any sort of way, right?
We're not going to talk about the mess that is the NVD Linux Foundation. Is it
That's
a
a whole
bug or
separate-
that's a whole nother
whole separate
conversation.
Okay,
So right
all
now, I would say, sadly, we have to start looking at third parties to be more alert and up to date on CVEs that are actually actively happening and keeping that information up to date. Because also, I haven't checked the NVD in a while because I love using this as a little like excuse for everything in my life in the security space. I'm just a software engineer. Like I don't look at the NVD every day, but at the same time, I know that for a while, and someone can chime in for this, the NVD wasn't populating a lot of CVEs, and so you should be looking at more than just one CVE library to see what's up to date. But I'll kind of step in and say, and this is kind of one of the reasons I connected with Kyle and how I got involved in this conversation, was that I think a lot of people, when they think about supply chain, they think about the post-developer supply chain, but they're not thinking about the fact that really a lot of the supply chain issues start with the developer. And that's why I like talking about this, because security, I don't want to say security people don't talk about, but it's just an angle that I don't think is taken as seriously or as trained as aggressively as it should be, because like, look at me, I'm a developer. My biggest risk, and we saw this just as a huge risk a lot, and I think about supply chain a lot with open source, is that you go on Stack Overflow, you're trying to figure out how to do something, you're at work, and I mean, my company, I learned recently, doesn't have a process for installing new packages. Like, why should I just be able to run and install a new package on my computer that I just went on Stack Overflow? Somebody wrote a really convincing answer, and then I installed that package that they use, and then boom, I'm compromised. Boom, everything is compromised. Like, no one talks about that. And I think that actually recently this was pointed out on a higher stage, and has come more into light as even just that specific instance of like just trusting a Stack Overflow reply to be accurate and give you safe responses. And I remember when I first talked to Kyle about this, it's like, and I told him this straight up. I'm like, I'm a developer. I'm dumb. I know this. I make dumb decisions. I know I make bad decisions, and I know that they're not security conscious decisions. And I think that's like the crux and the paradox and the paralysis of being a developer is, how do I make those trade-offs as someone who's security knowledgeable versus like, what if you're not security knowledgeable? Like, you're going to make those bad decisions. You're going to push to use that new technology. Your decision makers are more interested in things that are going to make you more efficient, more productive, getting your code done faster, that they don't want to slow down the decision process to consider the ramifications of just installing a random package that you saw off of Stack Overflow, or the new trendiest CVE, or excuse me, not CVE, the new trendiest open source project. But no one wants to actually think about what's going to happen after.
Well, I will actually counter that. I think you're 100% right. There's two extremes. There's nobody in the middle, and everyone needs to get to the middle, but there are super regulated things like banks.
Yeah.
And they
I work at a finance company, and they don't care.
Okay.
And I'm like, no!
Well, the ones in Canada seem to care a little bit more.
We work with Canada!
Well, in Canada. So a bunch of the banks here don't let people install things. Like PIP is blocked, NPM is blocked. Like, it's all blocked. You have to get it through their copy of the repo. But you could imagine, as a developer, how agitated those developers get, because they're like, oh my goodness, like everything is just slowed to a crawl at a snail's pace now. So you're either absolutely infuriating the developers, or you're like introducing security bugs. So there's kind of like these right now. And there's got to be somewhere happy in the middle that everyone can meet up.
What is mind-blowing to me that I don't think people understand when it comes to like developers just being able to install whatever they want with pip. This is, it's intended for this to happen, but most people don't recognize, like, a lot of these software packages use a setup.py file or pyproject.toml with wheel distributions and whatnot. So that is literally code execution on a system. Every time you do pip install and you download a package and you're installing that dependency, it could be running whatever the heck it wants. And it took me like 15 minutes to make a proof of concept that was reaching out to my impersonated or simulated C2 server. So I think malicious dependencies is something that's going to continue to skyrocket in popularity. And for those that are interested in threat intel, it seems very odd to me that every article I read about malicious dependencies is attributed to North Korea. A lot of people think like North Korea has no technology. Well, they know which targets to hit. The supply chain is probably a good one.
I mean, there was also that story that came out recently about the one person in Tennessee, I think, who helped
the laptop farm
that helped 2,000 people in North Korea get a job. No before just accidentally hired someone who worked at North Korea. But and I'll say this and I'll add to Kyle, so I could talk about this forever, especially being like a streamer. I could just yap. One of the first stories I wrote about for ThreatWire as a news show was about a Python supply chain attack, and using just as soon as the code was run locally, it was a compromised system. And I had a come to Jesus moment with that. When I wrote it, I was like, this is my life. Like, this is my purpose. I'm Jewish also, so saying come to Jesus is edgy.
So yeah, to bring it back to the original question.
Yeah, sorry. We're yapping.
So the answer I gave earlier is my professional opinion. My personal opinion that I'm a lot more passionate about, the biggest challenge in securing the software supply chain is that we actually don't know enough vulnerabilities in open source ecosystems. I mean, we look at GitHub security advisories as like the de facto vulnerability database for open source projects, and there's like 20,000 reviewed advisories. Well, NPM alone has like 3 million unique packages, and we're not talking about releases, we're talking about packages. So like you would expect at least 20,000 vulnerabilities in those 3 million plus. And if you look deeper at those vulnerabilities, like there's a significant chunk that are attributed to specific projects. So like NuGet, I think, has 600 advisories, and roughly half of them are for Chakra Core, which is one Microsoft library. So,
and that's just the open source projects that publish their security advisors through GitHub, because then you have a whole host of very large open source projects that do not default to GitHub security advisories. So that's like an email thread or a distro, and that's where, you know, CVEs and all that are your place to go. And we already touched on that subject, so.
Yeah, and I mean, you bring up a great point, Kayla, too, which is, you know, those are a lot of the things that I see or challenges that I run into when we're building vulnerability management programs at organizations, right? Is just getting all of the data in the right spot to be able to even consume it, right? There's so many places, so many websites, as you said, that you have to regularly go pull advisories from and then integrate it, right? And Kyle, I did the quick math. It's like less than 1%. It's like 0.006%, right? From that number that you put previously. And I think some of the challenge just comes in the way that open source is designed, right? It's supposed to be you do it when you want to do it, how you want to do it, and it contributes to the community, right? And sure, there are some guidelines and rules around there, right? But there's not any really hard requirements, right, or guidance around a lot of those. And you know, Nicole, I come from financial services as well, spent 10 years in it, and I am right there with you. And Ali, right there with you with it's a Russian nesting doll problem, because a lot of what you talk about, Ali, is like, well, have we removed local admin from the developers? Well, no, right?
We're not going to do that.
In order to do that, like, you have to have things like just-in-time privilege escalation, right? You have to have, right, a fully fleshed out, automated, approved library of packages, right? And then you just back your way up and you're just like going all the way down the stack, right? And you're just like, oh my God, this is almost impossible, right? So to your point, Kyle, I think most organizations today, because of the, sporadicness, infrastructure, whatever it may be, are just not set up for success. They need something that's going to pull that together.
Absolutely. Thanks for expanding upon the conversation there. I know that's a great question to start off with, to really get the conversation going. I want to dig into something a little bit more specific now, specifically reachability. So there seems to be a lot of debate about whether reachability offers value or not. What is reachability, and does it really matter? Why does vulnerability context help, or why does it not help? Kayla, I'd like to start with you, and then we can continue the conversation from there.
Oh, start with me on that. I don't know. You know why I feel it's because I've seen Kyle's posts on this, and they're pretty.
I know this is a topic for sure. But yeah, let's.
To be honest, Kyle, I want you to lead this off, because you've done so much research in reachability analysis, and the posts that I've seen, you've educated me a lot in this space, honestly. So I unless other folks, of course, but I'd love to hear Kyle go first on this one. Sorry to throw you under the bus again, Kyle, going first.
It's fine. I kind of wanted to at least preface that, like, if you don't think reachability is effective, I won't take it personal. For those that don't know, my day job is essentially supporting the reachability analysis for Semgrep. But I guess my TLDR argument for why I think it's impactful is that so static analysis, typically, it's not perfect. You have to make some guesses. But if you make those guesses in a safer way, meaning that, like, you assume that a node is going to be called or a function is going to be called, then you can pretty reasonably safely say whether or not a function or class, et cetera, is being called when the application is going to hit runtime. And then there's also runtime reachability. There's all types of different reachability analysis that all have pros and cons. But my argument is largely just around the tech debt and security debt problem. A lot of people purchasing SCA products have tens of thousands of supply chain vulnerabilities. You can't just tell them to go update your dependencies. Like, it's not a feasible answer. If you tell them, hey, you have 1,000 vulnerabilities, but 10 or 100 are definitely being called by your application, now you can focus on those first 100 and you can be a lot more actionable. That's really the crux of it. I think reachability analysis is less effective moving forward. Like, if we started from scratch, if we just deleted all of our code and started over and told everybody, keep your dependencies up to date, reachability analysis is less effective. But because of the security debt problem, it's tremendously impactful.
Yeah, so I'll add a little bit here. I think that in my past life, many moons ago, when I first started out in vulnerability scanning, I was definitely that security person who was like, the scanner says so. Sorry, the scanner identified a problem. This thing is out of date. I don't care, actually, what if you're using it, if it's never going to be, you're never going to pull it in. It's never going to run. It's never going to do anything. The scanner says it's there. Okay, therefore, you need to fix this thing. Of course, I have wisdom now, I hope to say, a little bit of it added on to these years later, to understand there's complexities in there. Exactly what you're talking about, Kyle. I think that is a huge part of our challenges today in vulnerability management. And then also when you're talking about what the things you don't necessarily own too, is being able to really prioritize and tell your teams what matters, what needs to be remediated now versus what can we delay, what can be second priority. And like my question, I don't, maybe anyone on the panel here has the answer to this, like, who internally, other than Kyle, is actually conducting reachability analysis? Like, how much of a practice is that even for organizations? Like, who has the resources to do that on a
lot of
basis?
People, yeah, you're exactly right. They have to outsource it to a company, because if you did that manually, like, you wouldn't be having time to do anything else.
Yeah, and that's kind of what our goal was. I think I wasn't at Semgrep at the origination of the product, but we're essentially trying to replace some number of security engineers on your team to say, like, a Semgrep researcher has looked at the advisory, determined what functions are affected by the vulnerability, and to highlight that in your code when you're calling it, if you're calling it. So historically, people get a finding saying you're using a vulnerable dependency. The developer gets the report from the security engineering team. They then go look at their application. They say, hey, what the heck, man? Like, this is imported, but we're not actually using it anywhere in our application. Or they look at the advisory. They see it's only affected, or you're only affected if you have, like, this really nuanced edge case. And they're like, what the heck? This doesn't impact us. So with our reachability analysis feature, it's also kind of a way to help the security engineer developer friction and highlight problems that are more likely to be received well by the developer. And it also gives you a nice, easy, clickable reference to where in your code you're making that function call. So like for me, reachability analysis isn't so binary as like risk or no risk. It's more of, I treat it more as a triage feature. So like I triage a lot of open source projects and their SCA vulnerabilities, and I can just very easily click the reference, see where in the code it's making these function calls, and be like, oh, it's not receiving unsanitized user input, or there's a constant being passed to this function, so it's not exploitable. I can ignore this. And so it takes it from like an hour of searching through GitHub repos or in VS Code, whatever, to seconds.
And I would add on to that reachability from so some people have heard of VulnDB, right? As well, has a lot of reachability type of stuff in it, right? When you're looking to triage. So in the software vulnerability management side of the world, right, use it all the time. And I like, Kyle, your example of triage, right, because that's what it's intended to be, right? It is not in any way, shape, or form, please understand, it's not in any way, shape, or form supposed to be, we can forget about that and never have to patch it again in the future, right? Like there are, and you go and look at VulnDB, and you look at some of the recent breaches, right, and there's exploits that are 2-3 years old that are just now starting to actually hit, right, and see exploits happening. So how many people are doing it on the software side? Like Nicole said, little to none, right? Because it's a manpower issue, right? I would say that there are more people using it, and I'm right there with you, Kyle. I think if you don't think it matters, I'd like to know why. We should have a long conversation, right? Because why wouldn't you want to triage and know, which things you should be prioritizing first in a limited resources, limited time perspective, right? And why wouldn't you want to look at something, like a tool like Semgrep, right? To be able to go in and say, hey, these people are already doing the analysis for me, right? How can I leverage this to force multiply, my team? The problem that I see here is it's education, right? Because not only does your vulnerability team have to go and do those things, right? But now your C-suite, whatever, has to be educated, right, on how you're doing it, why you're doing it, right? Auditors have to be educated, right? All of those things. And you have to maintain a lot of meticulous documentation, right? You have to have it incorporated into change management processes for your future, right? And so, yes, it matters, right? But as with everything, right, there are lots of, I would say, foundational pieces, right, that you have to put in order to make that functional.
Yeah, the audit piece and the education piece, just kind of worldwide, is seemingly, I think, one of the biggest hurdles. Like a lot of people purchase SCA products so that they can produce quality SBOMs and make their customers happy, because now customers are requesting SBOMs and they want to see no higher critical vulnerabilities, for example. Well, a lot of people will say, it's unreachable, therefore there's not a whole lot of risk, and the customer, the person receiving the SBOM, could either say, oh, okay, I know what reachability is, there's no risk here, or they could say, I don't care, it's still a higher critical vulnerability, you need to fix it before I purchase this application or continue to use this application. So it's a pretty messy space, I would say. There's some people that get it, some people that don't, and hopefully will eventually. But I mean, the White House executive order is a perfect example. I don't think any government vendors are trying to justify, like, we're not patching this because it's unreachable. I don't think the government would appreciate that.
Yep, completely agree.
Kyle, I want to dig into something you just mentioned, actually, which is SBOM. And I want to talk about how SBOM is software bill of materials. I want to talk about how that can enhance software supply chain security and what steps organizations can take to improve and implement SBOM effectively. And Kyle, I know you just mentioned it. We could start with you. AJ, Nicole, Kayla, Ali, feel free to jump in.
I can jump in.
Yeah.
So for anybody who doesn't know, there's two really big formats. There's an XKCD for everything. There's more than two, but the two big ones are SPDX and Cyclone. And there's a lot of awesome open source things that you can integrate into your CI/CD to generate an SBOM. There's also things like Daggerboard, which will consume an SBOM and then tell you vulnerabilities, but not reachability of those vulnerabilities based on the SBOM. But what I find them really useful for is giving you a snapshot of what was the project at that point in time. What were my licenses? What were the versions that I had? Because sometimes it's hard to remember, exactly what version did we have when. So it's kind of a nice way to look back at that. It also helps you build attestations, like SASA attestations. And so in general, I'm pro people generating SBOMs and asking for SBOMs, because that whole problem we discussed earlier of nobody knows what they have, that's one small piece of it. I mean, that's not going to cover everything. It is one small piece of it, but something's better than nothing. And getting that SBOM from a vendor or getting that SBOM from something that you're using at least gives you a better idea of, okay, what is in here? And when somebody says, oh God, there was a news article on XYZ, you could quick query it and be like, oh, well, at least it doesn't seem to have it there. Let me go look elsewhere in my environment and see if I have it hiding elsewhere.
I'm dead curious, because like, if we had to put a percentage number on it, what percentage of vendors are producing SBOMs? Because from my perspective, anytime I ask for one, people look at me like I have 3 heads, right? So
I think it's your nerdy security company. So the companies that I've worked at recently, ActiveState, we generate it every single time a developer builds anything. We build them an SBOM and a SASA attestation. Boom. At GitLab, always had SBOMs for everything because customers want it. So everywhere I've worked, but they've all been very security conscious companies with government contracts, produces SBOMs. But I'm thinking, if that's not your customer base and that's not your space, you're probably like, well, I don't need it, so why am I going to add some extra widget into my CI/CD that I don't need to worry about?
would you, I guess, from, again, question panel here, like, would you guys say though that if you are writing code internally, right, for your organization internally, it's still important for you to produce an SBOM for the applications and code you're producing? So
I'm maybe not so sure. So like an SBOM, I think you should be able to produce an SBOM, a quality one. But I think what's more important and kind of the underlying issue to why producing a quality SBOM and an accurate SBOM is so difficult today is that rarely do people practice proper reproducible builds. So like, I think that's the crux of the issue. But coming from more of an information security background, like the obvious answer is you can't secure what you don't know you have. And so like, just the fact that we struggle to produce SBOMs is just mind-boggling to me. And then you see the White House executive order requiring SBOMs. Well, Department of Homeland Security just put out a bid for people to help the federal government produce artifact dependency graphs. That's like a critical component of generating a quality SBOM. So if they can't produce a quality SBOM, why are we requiring them? And then don't get me started on like lower level language builds. Like nobody is doing C++ SBOM generation properly. You look at some major products that release SBOMs publicly, and you see all their PyPy libraries, you see all their whatever high level ecosystem libraries, and then you look at the C ones, and it's like, okay, well, you got 2 of the 100. Like,
so what you're saying before Allie joined is what I said, like, developers are the problem here. That's what we're saying, right? Like,
Well, it works on my computer, and if it works
exactly.
on my
Works
computer,
on local.
it's a huge problem. It's not my problem, of course. No, I'm sorry. When you were just like, can any developer do it? Like, I know, like, so I feel at ease talking about current company because I don't tell people where I work. And so I don't mind talking a little bit more freely about what it is or what happens. And I can say that from what I understand, no SBOMs are generated from what I know, but also at the same time, you say like how many developers can do that? I mean, the only time I've actually ever interacted with an SBOM was when I had a startup and we were trying to get we were trying to do some government stuff. And that was in 2017, 2018, when the SBOM was a Excel file and we had to talk about encryption. And I was like, can you understand this person asking? Because I don't think you can. But I will also call out that you're seeing different sectors of the government have different takes and different requirements for generating their code in general. And like, as you said, like one asking to help with SBOMs, and it's just like, respectfully, we know that the best engineers who should be doing those kinds of jobs and doing that really critical infrastructure work are not going into government because they want paychecks. But that's not their story. That's another story. we're not going to bring that up here, but it's good to see people who are willing to do that work. And I really, really, really encourage it. It's just people work for different reasons. But
you mentioned how, like, is the person on the receiving end actually going to understand it, like the encryption piece? That has been really fascinating to me. So prior to Semgrep, I worked as a penetration tester for financial institutions, which many of you seem to be familiar with. And towards the latter part of my career there, some of the customers were asking, like, should we be requesting SBOMs from our software vendors? And my response was typically, are you ever going to look at it? What are you going to be doing with it? Why would you ask for it? And there are some platforms out there that ingest SBOMs and tell you vulnerabilities, but just like the internal problem where you have 1,000 SCA vulnerabilities, how do you triage and be actionable with them? Imagine having 100 SBOMs and trying to do something valuable with them. It's just a scaled problem that we can't handle at the micro level. So
Yeah.
I mean, talking about, like, it's not reachability, but we talked about context of reachability. The context of the SBOM is knowing this SBOM was here, and is that a critical system? Does it have any kind of access to anything? Psh, don't care. It doesn't do anything important. Versus this one does do something important. We may want that. And I think a lot of people just blanket ask and then don't contextualize it.
I also think that SBOM is, as we've all said it in various ways, is a top-down compliance forced activity, 100% based off of compliance. You're only we're producing one because someone asked us to in order to prove that we are doing the right thing, quote unquote. And I love the idea of SBOMs. I think they're super important. I think we did it well. They would be so helpful because when you do, Nicole, you brought up a great example. When some new vulnerability is introduced in some crazy package you're not even sure if you're using, that's what an SBOM is supposed to be for. Help you prioritize your incident response and your vulnerability management. And I think that the true need, though, is that we're going to have a different use case for SBOMs beyond just compliance. Because if it's purely government and compliance driven, like you were saying, AJ, there's going to be a whole crap ton of people who are like, ugh, I'll deal with that when I have to, if I have to. And maybe I'll just produce something because no one's going to look at it anyways, but I'll check the box. So we need we need them to work well. We need them to be easy to create and maintain. And we need that really solid use case that can be generalized for all of technology and operations versus just GRC. So I don't know what that is yet. I think maybe the key first is getting them to be able to be produced and maintained easily first, and then we figure out what other cool initiative can we use these for. But I think there might be a bit of a struggle getting wide and mass adoption until we have that at least dual use case really solidified.
What's funny
I would
is
agree.
So there was there still is the OWASP dependency track project, which I found really fascinating because I think it was their 15-year anniversary. They released a blog post, maybe 10-year. And they talk about how, for the first 10 or so years that it was available to the public, there was like maybe 100 users. And now, ever since the executive order, there's like now many, many thousands of users trying to either experiment with it or using it in production. So it's funny to, like, this conversation we're having today was likely had 15 years ago, but nobody seemed to care.
And I think you bring a great point, Kayla, but I also would say I think it starts with compliance, right? It's like that's what's driving the action. To your point, Kyle, the executive order is driving the behavior, right? Whether we like it or not. But I think when we talk about this practically from an organizational perspective, and someone, maybe a director or CISO or someone is looking to say, how do I implement SBOM into my organization, right? Or how can I use it in my organization? My advice to you would be step one, step back and take a look at the entirety of your program, right? And is there a mapping that's there, right? Have you gone through all of the foundational dependencies, or are you just trying to say, yeah, tell my third party vendor risk team to start asking for SBOMs, right? And now it's there and it's checked and we've met the letter of the law, right? Or the letter of the requirement, right? I also have had some thoughts around that, which just says, okay, if you start getting SBOMs and there are critical vulnerabilities on there and all you're doing from them is a compliance perspective, right? Are you now introducing risk to your organization because it is now negligence because you're aware of it, right? But you're not actioning on it, right? And so I would caution you, right, that just pulling in SBOMs is not going to meet that compliance requirement. The next step is going to be, what are you doing with those? How are you actioning on them? How are you using them to improve the posture of your program? You know, and I'm sure most people, like Ali said, I don't even understand this, right? Like, what are we talking about on here, right? And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity for Semgrep and other tools out there to say, hey, this is your foundation, this is your baseline, this is the things that you need to do before you even go down this path, right? To paint a path to where people aren't ripping out things that you know, processes and other things that they do 2 months down the road.
So I kind of have a question based off of this as an engineer, my fascination. So you are on a security team for a company. You have SBOMs for all of the tools that you're using. You know all about all the packages you're using internally. But say one of your vendors that you're working with, you get an alert somehow through a module dashboard that's like they have a vulnerability and it's like really major. As a security personnel, how would you dream about responding internally, and what would you do externally for the customer? Like, would you say like, hey, we noticed you have this major vulnerability, we're going to just stop using you really quick right now? Like, what does that look like to y'all? I'm very curious.
It depends on what that tool is. So if it is a critical tool, you have your security people call and try to talk to their security people, and then you try and figure out, like, do you already know about this? Are you patching this? Is something coming? And try and apply pressure if hopefully, you know, you're spending enough money that you have an account manager that can apply pressure. If it's not on something important, you kind of go like, hey, there's this thing, are you going to patch it? And if they don't, you start coming up with like plan B to replace it or cut it off or isolate it, or defense in depth. Like, how can we at least mitigate this? If, you know, but if it's not a critical system, maybe we'll turn it off for a couple weeks, kind of like the NVD turned off for a couple weeks.
Yeah.
And my comment there would be, and this is something that I see all the time in third-party vendor risk, is, well, what does your BIA say, right? Like, what application is it tied back to? What business process is it tied back to, right? And so, you know, as you said, and I keep going back, it's like, okay, well, now we're back all the way back to software and hardware asset management, right? When jQuery came out and it was a problem, 99% of the people didn't even know that they had it, right? So I understand what your explanation, you know, Ali, like, what would your responses be? I would go back and say the majority of people have foundational issues. They're not even ready to talk about that yet, right?
Yeah.
But I agree with you, Nicole. Like, those would be the aspects. My immediate response, though, is just, well, to your point, what's the criticality of the application that's supporting the business process it's supporting?
Yeah. And it's making off those trade-offs.
In the like more regulated spaces, I think one major benefit of the SBOM that I can't really neglect is I remember Log4j happened and got constant emails from customers saying, do you guys use Log4j in any applications that touch our data? It's like, okay, no, first off. And second off, we don't have any applications. So it's kind of a weird question. But I assume that you're asking every single one of your vendors this question, and that's going to be really annoying. So like, maybe that is worth just me giving you an SBOM that is blank.
Cough Vex.
I'd about to say, yeah.
Yeah. Vex is an interesting one to me because that is a lot of trust to put into a vendor who, to manually say affected, not affected.
You're literally asking them in an email, do you have Log4j? Tell me yes or no. This is just making that a more automatable process. So yeah. I agree with you. You're choosing to trust someone, but you're choosing to trust them via email or Vex. At least the Vex you can automate with like an API and stuff.
Yeah, no, I get you. I think more just generally, like similar to our reachability. So when we produce an SBOM, we notate reachable versus unreachable, similar to what a Vex would produce. but there's technically no like signing, like artifact signing of that produced SBOM that says like this was generated by Semgrep. Nobody manipulated this. And I think the same thing, well, Vex is mostly manually documented at this point, but I think eventually what would be nice to see is automated tools that notate that can't be manipulated after the fact.
If you're doing SASA for your build and you're generating your SBOM and your Vex as part of your build, active state, it gets signed with each build.
Yeah.
So
maybe a deeper question that we don't need to go too far on, but you mentioned producing SBOMs in CI. I think a hot topic lately is where do you produce the SBOM? Pre-build, during build, post-build, runtime, and I think I asked pretty much everybody this in Vegas during Hacker Summer Camp, and the answer I feel most confident in sharing is I think we need to produce SBOMs at all the stages and aggregate them and understand why there's differences. Like if I have an SBOM in CI and then at runtime there's additional packages or components, what introduced those additional packages? What did I run like sudo apt update when I first started my container? If so, maybe I should stop doing that because that's not a standard build practice. But
damn developers.
Well, you can share that one with DevOps.
I actually, that is such a like a developer and DevOps thing to do. Like at the last minute, add more dependencies that you just like aren't fully aware and wanting to keep things up to date. And yeah, developers talk about like code freezes when they deploy, but let's just be real, it's not a real accurate picture of what's actually happening.
And I guess one thing is a lot of people see SBOMs as kind of a one and done, but I think your point that you made is you really need SBOMs for like each little tiny step along the supply chain process so that you can tell at this point it was this, at this point it was this, and then hey, you could actually do a diff and be like, what did get introduced between A and B and C? Because maybe you're going to catch like that's fishy. Why is that happening? I don't expect that to be happening.
Nobody said use blockchain for this yet, so have we just discussed that yet?
I definitely think that, like AJ, you touched on this a little bit. Like incentivization and top down is really a big part of this. Like your leadership on the engineering and development side of the house has to incentivize and support the creation and maintenance of SBOMs just as much as the security side of the house. So maybe if anything, it needs to be up even one step higher. You know, it has to be top down, supported and incentivized for people to be able to do this and have the bandwidth. Because everything we've just been talking about in my mind, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so much overhead. Oh my goodness. So it has to be incentivized properly so that people know that they have the time and the freedom and the responsibility to do this along the way. And I think that's going to come along with our journey as we develop these things into a more maintainable practice as well.
Yeah, and I love that top-down comment. So sorry, one thing, like I look at the Microsoft thing and their commitment to be a security-focused company, right? Even Microsoft with their billions and billions of dollars, to your point, can you imagine how much product stoppage that they're going to have to push out the door to actually implement? Like think of all the roadmaps that Microsoft has, all the development teams, right? To actually implement SBOM appropriately, right? In my opinion, at the moment would have a material impact on their stock, right? And their stock price, right? And so their board and their chair, that's what their entire mission is, right? Is to ensure that that company grows. And so at that point, we can now say, well, regulation is really the only way to change that behavior because of how we have set up our society, right? And how we set up our sales process. So I fully agree. Like it's got to start at the top. I'm glad it's starting to make progress in that point, but it's going to be many, many years, right, before we see full and never full's the wrong word, right? Significant progress.
When I think of open source security programs at scale or software supply chain security at scale, I often point people to Google. I think they do an exceptionally great job as far as like supporting the Salsa project and just actually caring about build integrity and publicly speaking about it, sharing how they're doing it within Google. And then they also have their whole open source security research team where they support the OSS Fuzz project, where they're actually paying bounties to people that are finding bugs in open source projects. And they just do a lot of work for the open source community, which I think is great.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I mean, regarding the whole thing about like the top-down incentive, I feel like getting top-down buy-in is the number one battle every security team is constantly battling just to get top-down buy-in. I mean, and adding just another layer, it's always having to pick and choose whatever battle the business layer or the business and financial teams are willing to yield on for that quarter, for that year, for that minute, really. Regarding the Microsoft and saying that they're a security focused company from the top down. I mean, we saw what they did with Copilot Plus. Hello, that was an entirely internal secret project that no one knew about, and you had to be double permed in to even touch. So we know about that. Regarding regulation and regulation being the solution, I feel like such a conspiracy theorist when I talk about it with engineers and being like, oh my God, like, and I'll like conspiracy theorist here. I like genuinely, and this is going to sound so bad. I don't mind saying this. I've said it online multiple times. I genuinely think that the industry needs like a 2008 style financial crisis for cybersecurity to be taken seriously and for regulation to come in place to cause stricter standards for security teams to get and to get the tools they need to keep companies secure. Now, why that it gets hyper conspiracy theorist, because I'm like, well, actually, like the next war is actually like a cyber war. And like if we're in it right now, and then it just goes off the rails. And I know it sounds crazy and I know I'm crazy about it, but I have to like still formulate my little topics. But it's just like, I do think obviously regulation is the way, and we're seeing a lot of steps towards that. And I feel like, especially in the modern White House today, we're seeing a lot more discussion about software security in general and putting out regulations and memos that unprecedented regulations and memos. I mean, we all saw that one memo about using memory safe languages, and all the engineers were like, oh my God, White House said use Rust, and lost it, but kind of missed the point. We all kind of missed the point there. I'm glad that someone thought that was funny. But I also wanted to touch on the Google and there's in packages and supporting the open source security community. I mean, also internally with Google for getting internally a package approved, you have to have like a full-fledged discussion. There's like I've talked to people about this. There's like a whole message board that they have about like, do you think I should be allowed to install this? And obviously there is like the security team aspect of keeping that safe, but also there's like a social dynamic discussion about whether packages are important or not, and should they be included and used at Google. It was a lot.
I think you'd
mentioned
like finance and business and things, and one argument I always have with my partner is in fact I gave a talk at ShmooCon about this one, is I think that everybody in security should kind of learn a little bit about every other group in the company and be able to talk their language, because if you can't figure out how do I make things as secure as possible within this business, because the business exists to be a business. You can't make it stop being a business. Otherwise, they're just going to fire you. You're not going to have a job. But if you can say, hey, finance, this is going to help you do this, or it's going to mitigate this in their language. And if you can talk to the business that way, if you can talk to the lawyers that way, you could get the lawyers on your side. You could get the finance team on your side. And then suddenly you have 3 or 4 teams all saying like, yes, this MFA thing they want to do, apparently that's going to be great. Let's do the thing. And so just being able to have the conversation helps you get what you want, and regulation will definitely help with that, but also being able to talk in the business's language, I think, helps with that.
Okay, so we have 2 minutes left, which means I have plenty of time to cancel myself. A lot of this discussion is like security engineer versus developer. I hate that. I hate that so much. It's why not developer being more secure? Why is that not the obvious answer? Why?
Please.
And
I'm so passionate about this.
There's so many. The canceling part, I think there's a generational gap. I mean, if you look at a traditional computer science program 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, they definitely were not teaching secure software development practices. Today, we're starting to see that a little bit, still not enough, I think. But the people that I grew up with, and maybe because I'm so passionate about security, I just surrounded myself with like-minded folk, which is very likely. But we don't want to produce poor code. It's like embarrassing. That's like wearing beat up shoes to school. It's like your code sucks. So I think we kind of need more. I don't want to say this out loud, but I'm going to anyway. We almost need more elitism in the software development space. I think the open source space has a lot of it, maybe too much. But on the commercial side, I think people are just going with the wind, saying, nobody's ever going to see this code. Nobody's ever going to look at this code. I'm just going to make it work to meet my deadline.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, okay.
Because that's what we incentivize them to do, right? Like, people do what they are incentivized to do, right? So I agree with you, Kyle. Like, that's where it should be, right? And when I set up a software supply chain or a software security program, right, back in 2018, that was the first thing I did, was bring in an external firm and educated our developers, right, on the security in the language that they were coding in, right? But again, you know, I don't know what it was. I think it was like 40 grand for every 10 developers, right? Not to mention, I'm taking them all away from their development for a week, right? And so I'm with you. It's just it's a tough problem to crack.
One of the things, like when I was doing DevRel, I mean, I do agree that there needs to be secure coding practices taught in education from day one. When you first write your first line of code, is teaching them how to write code properly. I mean, such a common thing developers do is, oh my God, I just like accidentally pushed the company keys to the GitHub repo. Oopsies. And you're just like, why would, like, we know to do better than that. And we all know to do better than that. Like, where along the process of education are we failing to teach secure development and I did DevRel for 5 years. So I focused in communicating with developers, showing them how products work, and also writing tutorials and documentation. And I've spoken and I've called out developers writing documentation who are writing documentation and basic examples with insecure code. Like, why are you, and this is the same example, like, why are you showing in your basic example, just put your product key right in the code? Why are we showing that from day one, when we should say, like, at minimum, don't do, or in bright red letters say, like, this is why this is wrong, but this is just a demo. If you need to know how to safely store your product keys, click here. And that's easy content for a DevRel. And I know they can do that. So
Awesome. Well, you are all good. Ali, we are at our time. Thank you, everyone, for joining. This was such a great discussion. I had such a great time moderating, and thank you all for your thoughtful answers. Thank you for posing questions in the chat as well. I am dropping Semgrep's event page into the chat. Feel free to join our upcoming webinars. Again, thank you to all of our speakers. To our speakers, feel free to plug your blog, your LinkedIn, anything that you would like our attendees to follow up on or see you on in the chat. And again, thank you all for joining, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thanks all.
Thanks so much.